Hello and welcome to the memory card. Things are pretty exciting right now as far as video games go, considering we're just a few days away from the release of God of War, and I'm also looking forward to South Park: The Fractured Butthole getting released on the Nintendo Switch so I can finally play that. But while all this exciting stuff is going on, like the release of Nintendo Labo, I figured why not do something really cutting edge and really relevant? Start importing old Japanese games and consoles. So let's take a look at the Super Famicom and some of the differences about the system itself and its games and all that in comparison to the Super Nintendo, and general things about dealing with import gaming. The Super Famicom, the Japanese Super Nintendo, was released in a box like this, which, as you can tell, is a lot more colorful than what we got in America. I don't actually have a box for my Super Nintendo. I have the Classic Edition, though, and this does a good job representing the general graphic design of the time. It's a lot more blacks and reds and the muted color of the Super Nintendo itself that we got in America. Considering in the early 90s, its main competition were things like the Sega Genesis, Nintendo thought that going really colorful would just make people think it's just some dumb kiddie system, at least from what I've heard at the time. But in Japan, the market wasn't really that way. You could have more colorful designs like this, and for some reason a box that has a styrofoam bottom. Not really sure why they did that. But I do really like all the colorful sides. They all match the colorful buttons on the face of the Super Famicom controller, which, as you'd imagine, is functionally identical, but it's got some different colors and also doesn't have the mixture of concave and convex buttons like the Super Nintendo controller has. That, and also, the controller length is really short for the Super Famicom controller. Whereas with the Super Nintendo controller, I'm pretty sure you could rappel down a ravine or a really tall bridge with this controller. I haven't tried that, but pretty sure that would work. So that's one thing to keep in mind if you want to actually import a Super Famicom. If you can have it set up to where you can comfortably have the console not very far from you, considering the controller length, then that might present some problems. Also, the Super Famicom console itself has some interesting design differences between that and the Super Nintendo that we got in America. Differences with the power switch, and the eject button, and the reset button, and just call them a game cassette for some reason. And that's something else that's different about the Super Famicom. Super Nintendo cartridges were designed very differently than the Super Famicom cartridges, which worked as a physical region locking. You can fit a Super Famicom cartridge into a Super Nintendo as long as you take out the little tabs that fit into the back of a Super Nintendo cartridge. That's the main thing for actual region locking, because as you imagine, you can fit a Super Famicom cartridge in, but not a Super Nintendo one considering the size difference. There was also a major difference in the design of the cartridge boxes for the Super Famicom. They were a bit longer in design. And this one for Pop and Twinbee here has some nice colors to it. I really like the design of its box. Whereas, for example, for the Super Nintendo, got Link to the Past here. It's got that general design that we had in America with a lot more of the blacks and grays and reds. Not really all that colorful, but still cool and still very iconic for our culture. But in Japan, they were a bit more similar to, I suppose, the NES boxes, except a bit more narrow and tall. And inside Super Famicom boxes, you don't have the cardboard inserts, you have these interesting plastic ones. Still have the manual and all that like you'd expect. Just a different kind of aspect ratio to it, I guess. And it still has the normal the same controller inputs. So you can use a Super Nintendo controller from America on here, which will help if you don't like the small controller length of the Super Famicom. And thankfully, the Super Famicom just uses the normal AV out, so you can still use your composite cables on that, or RF for some reason if you want to have really terrible video. And also, for some reason, The AC adapter for the Super Famicom is insanely big and heavy. The good thing about this is if for some reason someone tries to attack you or rob you or anything while you're playing some Super Famicom games, you can just turn off the system and take out the AC adapter, and you have a ready-made self-defense weapon because this thing is heavier than most baseballs or boulders. And about the size of them, too. So now that I've talked about the hardware for the Super Famicom and its controller and all that, let's talk a little about the games. Now, for importing games, especially importing Japanese games, what you should import and what's smarter to import is going to depend a lot on how much of the written Japanese language that you know. Now for me, at the moment, I don't really know much, so for someone with little to no knowledge of written Japanese, the better kind of genres to focus on are puzzle games, platformers, fighting games, scrolling shooter games, shoot 'em ups, things where the story and text is not really that important. Now, you can get a lot of Super Famicom games cheaper than their American Super Nintendo counterparts, partially because not as many people import games because, I mean, realistically, a lot of the reason why people will collect old retro games is trying to recapture their childhood and focusing on nostalgia or focusing on things that they didn't really know about but had some interest in, or just weird little quirky games that they never really had the chance to play. Now, a lot of people in America didn't really play Japanese Super Famicom games. Importing wasn't as common back in the 90s. So people are less likely to go buy those games. That can be a bit more of a hassle. But nowadays there's a lot of options for playing the Japanese import games. You've got all the different clone consoles, and then you have a really good option, which honestly, if you're wanting to play on a modern TV, you don't have an old CRT like I do, the best option I would say to play a Super Famicom game and Super Nintendo games in general would be the analog Super NT. It is just really high quality and is definitely one of the best options nowadays to play these 16-bit games. But I'll show a little bit of gameplay of the couple Super Famicom games I have at the moment because I've just recently started importing games. So I'll show a bit of Poppin' Twinbee, which is an amazing vertical scrolling shooter. Love the art style. The gameplay is really fun. It's really hectic trying to juggle all the different bells that you shoot out of the clouds because you have to shoot them to change their color to get different kind of power-ups and that kind of thing, and also deal with enemies in the background and foreground. It's just really hectic and a lot of fun. And I'll show a little bit of the Super Famicom release of Super Mario All-Stars, which really there's no problem trying to play that as an import game, considering you don't really need to read much to play a Mario game, especially the old 2D ones. The main interesting thing for me is, for one thing, it was a lot cheaper, especially to get the boxed copy that I have. And also, when you're selecting your titles, it shows the original Famicom and Famicom Disk System cover art for those games. And it's just interesting to see the difference between what was shown in Japan for their cover art versus what we got on the NES. And also, an example of a import game that I got that will probably be difficult for me to get through for a while, Gunbare Goemon, because there is a fair amount of text in that, and all the different shops and the story and all that, and at the moment I don't understand any of it, so that makes it a bit more difficult for me. So definitely make sure that you keep whatever your knowledge is of written Japanese in mind whenever you're considering going into import gaming. But overall, I am definitely glad that I got a Super Famicom, and I'm glad that I went the route of getting the actual physical console itself, because you can actually adjust your Super Nintendo to be able to play Japanese Super Famicom cartridges, but the way to do that is tearing out the little tabs that's in the cartridge slot on the Super Nintendo, and I don't really like messing with my consoles that way. I don't like breaking things on them, and I try to avoid modding them in any way I can. The only reason I did the Blinking Light Win mod for my NES is because I actually wanted to be able to play the games on my Nintendo. But I'm definitely glad that I got the actual console itself. I really like the design on the Super Famicom. I'm not sure if I'd necessarily like it more than the American Super Nintendo. I like them both different ways. I mean, the American one is iconic for our culture as far as games goes, considering the Super Nintendo is one of the most popular, beloved consoles ever made, and for good reason. But it's nice having the variety in these different consoles and having something dedicated to play my Japanese imports. But definitely, if you're going to be trying to look into import gaming now, probably the smartest option, especially if you don't have a physical Super Nintendo or Super Famicom, is to get the analog Super NT, because you can just play all those games on the same console, and it'll look really good on a modern HD TV, and the colors will look great and all that. So, regardless, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on the memory card, where I look at something a little more modern.